and after studying the module, you shall be able to know first what is structuralist model, the early view of development as given by structuralists, and what is structural adjustment and development. To begin with, structuralist model is the alternate to liberal model. Unlike liberal thought, structuralists state that disparities are inevitable due to structural features of global economy. The roots of structuralism lie in Latin American countries and particularly Chile. In 1950, Raul Prebisch became the first director of Economic Commission of Latin America, that is ECLA. In Chile, he cooperated with Celso Furtado, Aníbal Pinto Santa Cruz, Osvaldo Sunkel, and Dudley Sees, who all became influential structuralists. Now coming to the evolution and explanation of theory. As suggested earlier, structuralism is a development theory which focuses on structural aspects which impede the economic growth of developing countries. It analyzes the transformation of a country's economy from mainly subsistence agriculture to a modern, urbanized manufacturing and service economy. Structuralist thinking suggests major government intervention in the economy to fuel the industrial sector, known as import substitution of industrialization, as a policy prescription. This structural transformation of the developing country is pursued in order to create an economy which, in the end, enjoys self-sustaining growth. This can only be attained by ending the reliance of the underdeveloped countries on exports of primary goods, that is, agricultural and mining products, and pursuing an inward-oriented development by shielding the domestic economy from developed economies. For this, trade with advanced economies is minimized through the erection of all kinds of trade barriers and an overvaluation of domestic exchange rate. Thus, the production of domestic substitutes of formerly imported industrial products is encouraged. The logic of this strategy rests on the infant industry argument, which states that young industries, specifically in the third world countries, initially do not have the economies of scale and experience to be able to compete with foreign competitors, and thus need to be protected until they are able to compete in the free market. The import substitution of industrialization from now on ISI strategy is supported by Prebisch and Singer theorem, which states that over time the terms of trade of primary commodities of developing countries deteriorate compared to the manufactured goods of advanced countries, as the income elasticity of demand is greater for manufactured goods than that for primary products. Structuralists argue that the only way third world countries can develop is through action by the state. Third world countries have to push industrialization and have to reduce their dependency on trade with the first world and trade amongst themselves. The earlier structuralist focus on the inherently unfavorable external environment and consequent export pessimism for developing countries had given rise to the concept of a foreign exchange constraint and a consequential foreign exchange gap. This initially provided the intellectual justification for official resource transfers to developing countries, which were expected to have large multiplier effects by relaxing the foreign exchange constraint. Structuralists also emphasized the need for massive domestic investment for capacity building in industry generally and particularly in infrastructure, using the state as an entrepreneurial agent to stimulate investment. Later academic work focused more attention on efficiency of resource use and factor productivity growth as key elements in economic dynamism. The focus on efficiency as a source of growth forced consideration of the economic environment as most likely to encourage efficiency. The concern with efficiency also restrained the enthusiasm about public sector investment as an engine of growth, as the performance of public sector as a whole in most developing countries clearly suffered from serious weaknesses, which weighed heavily against efficiency and growth. The experience in most countries showed the public sector to suffer from low levels of efficiency and inadequate profitability. This led to another thesis of structural reforms catering to economic reforms. This version of structural reforms had been advocated by the Bretton Woods twins, and it came about in the aftermath of the second oil shock in 1978-79 and was intensified after the debt crisis beginning with Mexico's debt moratorium, which revealed large external imbalances facing many countries. The traditional fund approach of correcting balance of payments disequilibria through reduction in aggregate expenditure levels, supplemented by exchange rate depreciation, was increasingly seen to be ineffective in view of the size of the external adjustment needed in most debt-burdened countries. It was recognized that reliance on this approach alone could produce stagflationary outcomes with a disruption in the growth process. The traditional bank approach, focusing on providing long-term project finance and thus indirectly filling critical foreign exchange gaps, was equally circumscribed in dealing with the post-debt crisis situation because of the limited volume of resources which could be mobilized by the bank and other aid donors in response to the greatly expanded need. The technical work of both the bank and fund staff during the 1980s repeatedly endorsed the need for larger concessional resource flows and easier debt rescheduling for developing countries. However, political realities were such that additional resources were not made available. Policymakers in the developing countries were obviously influenced by the retreat from structuralism in the academic world and could hardly ignore the consensus emerging in the multilateral institutions. But they also changed their views on the basis of their own experience in the 70s and 80s. Latin America's experience was dominated by the difficulties in adjusting to the oil shock in the 70s and subsequent and related debt crisis of the 80s. A characteristic feature of structural adjustment and reform programs implemented by most developing countries in the past 2 decades is that its agenda ranges over a number of sectors, macroeconomic as well as microeconomic or sectoral issues. The typical reform program, which includes the following elements, are: first, macroeconomic stabilization, that is, to minimize vulnerability to external shocks in national economy and encourage welfare enhancing growth through a framework for monetary and fiscal institutions and policies. Secondly, domestic deregulation of investment, production and prices. Thirdly, liberalization of foreign trade, that is, to loosen or remove tariff and non-tariff barriers. Fourthly, privatization of the public sector, which means the transfer of ownership, property or business from the government to the private sector. Fifth reform is the financial sector reform, which include reforms in banks, financial institutions, instruments and markets for increasing the operational efficiency of each of these constituent. Sixth, tax reforms. Seventh are labor market reforms. And eighth, social safety nets. Managing policy changes in so many dimensions poses special problems, especially when the reforms are obviously interrelated in the sense that the effectiveness of each element in the package depends upon other elements being successfully implemented. This interrelationship raises several issues about the design of the program. Since structural adjustment typically involves short-term costs and uncertainty, a financial system which emphasizes short-term performance indicators may not be the most suitable for encouraging long-term restructuring. By contrast, financial systems in which long-term capital is provided by banks, which have a much greater involvement in individual companies, are more likely to create an environment in which managements can count on sustained support of a long-term corporate strategy. The choice between these models is not easy to make, and this is an area where issues are unresolved even in the developed countries. However, the weaknesses of capital market should not blind one to their strength. Active capital markets have certainly helped the corporate sector in many developing countries to mobilize substantial resources from the public, and more recently also to attract funds from abroad. The limitation of capital markets, elaborated by critics of the Anglo-Saxon model, need to be kept in mind and corrected as far as possible on the basis of country-specific circumstances. This calls for extensive reform of the capital markets as part of financial sector reform. These reforms should aim at establishing independent regulation with a view to developing transparent trading practices, appropriate disclosure norms, and effective regulation of insider trading, takeover bids, etc. Privatization is a relatively recent addition to the agenda of policy reform in developing countries, but it has gained remarkable momentum in a very short while. Most privatization programs have been characterized by multiple objectives, with the relative emphasis varying from country to country. Mobilizing non-inflationary financial resources was clearly a very important motivation behind the sale of public sector assets in the case of many countries facing severe fiscal pressures. Second important objective behind privatization is the improvement of operational efficiency in the public sector. In fact, it is only if operational efficiency increases following privatization that there is any real efficiency gain to the economy as a whole. At this point, let's have a very brief idea about structural reforms and developing countries. Structural reform experience indicates that the range of reforms currently underway in developing countries is impressive and is underpinned by a very substantial convergence of thinking on policy issues. These experiences also indicate the problem areas in the design of structural reform programs, especially regarding the pace and sequencing of different elements. However, this should not cloud the fact that the area of consensus is very substantial. In any case, consensus on broad policy direction does not imply an identity of program design. Countries vary in initial conditions, including not only institutional and structural characteristics, but also in the extent of imbalance from which they may suffer, and these differences can be expected to produce differences in the design of reform programs. Some of the differences observed across countries are due to these considerations rather than any basic differences on policy. Let us now summarize what we have studied in the module. First, there is strong relationship between the structure of economy and development. Secondly, the structural change models focus on different productivity levels of economies. Thirdly, process of structural change determines the rate of development. Fourthly, structural change can be encouraged by incentives.